running a functional, galaxy-spanning government is no small task. The Republic existed for thousands of years before being taken down from the inside, while the Empire crumbled in decades due to overreach, and the New Republic was forced to recreate itself as the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances in a similar time period due to the stresses of war. Today, we will examine the lessons of the past and design the perfect government for the Star Wars universe. Now, as a prelude, I think it's clear that the galaxy cannot be controlled through tyranny. The Empire, the most militarized faction in Star Wars history, didn't have the ships to do so, and the use of superweapons and the Tarkin Doctrine only made rebellions militant. The Republic, on the other hand, stood for tens of thousands of years, so a democratic republic will be my starting off point. So let's start with a democracy based on the rule of law, and then examine several key principles of governance. And as I think we'll see, much of what it would take to run a galactic government is also key to running a country in the real world. And some of you might notice that this video is also serving as a sort of basic civics lesson. The bedrock of my government would be subsidiarity and the creation of a federation. Subsidiarity is a real-world legal principle which states that in a federation with division of powers, for example the United States, which has both the federal and state governments, decisions and governing should be done by the most localized body which can handle a particular matter. In other words, decisions about law and policy should be made by institutions as close to the individual as possible. The rationale behind subsidiarity is that closer bodies are more familiar with the circumstances and needs of their constituents. However, sometimes it's also desirable for uniform control across an entire organization or government, and that's where you see the power yielded to a higher authority. And if this doesn't make sense, don't worry, we'll get into an example which I think will help clear things up. So, subsidiarity is commonly associated with EU law, but it also plays into constitutional and public law generally in many countries. I'll talk about Canada, because that's the example I'm most familiar with. Canada, like all federations, has what's called division of powers. Basically, the federal government is responsible for some things, while provinces are responsible for others. The Constitution formalizes this division, or as we call it in Canada, distribution of powers, generally in line with the principles of subsidiarity. Provinces, for example, have control over the administration of justice within their province, property rights, and education, all areas where the province itself is best situated to legislate and lawmake. So the federal government, for example, is constitutionally barred from making a law about the education in one of the provinces. On the other hand, the federal government is responsible for creating things like the criminal code, the funding and management of the military, the postal services, the banking system, and other areas. So the provinces aren't able to make a law which amends the criminal code, for example. And again, this division is in line with the principles of subsidiarity. For example, with the criminal justice system or the banking system, it makes sense to have a uniform system across the country. As another example, the postal service is nationwide, so it doesn't make sense to allow a single province to make a rule about it. And when talking about something like the military, a single province would be incapable of actually managing such a large responsibility. Now, obviously, there's conflict here. Individual provinces or the federal government are always arguing that a certain type of law is within their jurisdiction, and that comes down often to a pith and substance discussion, which is way outside the scope of today's video. And the Canadian example is just that, an example. It's certainly not the only way to structure your federation, and the notion of subsidiarity is not inherent to a federation either. That being said, the idea of deferring to member states, I think, would be very important in a galaxy as large and diverse as the Star Wars galaxy. The needs of a person on Coruscant vary wildly from one on Mon Calamari or Dantooine, so the governments of those planets or systems should be given free rein to manage most aspects of the laws within their regions. The unitary or central government, like the Republic, should mainly be concerned with big picture, galaxy-wide issues. Some of the key ones that I can think off the top of my head would be the maintenance of hyperlanes, trading and taxation, upkeep of the holonet, and the management of the Republic's defense force. But other things like banking, would also probably be included. And this is essentially how the Old Republic operated, while the Empire took the opposite approach, a unitary government which imposed its will on all those it could. The Federation, on the other hand, is a much more natural government, and the Republic, for example, was born from an alliance between core worlds and developed from there, which makes sense. So this proper division of powers, and again that just means whether the Republic has the ability to make a law or an individual planet, is best accomplished by a strong constitution, upheld by a dedicated judiciary. We'll talk more about this later. But besides for these legal and mechanical functions, the Constitution should also create a set of protections, and this would be one of the main features of the Republic, sort of a spreading of civilization. And I'm not talking about imperialism or religiously motivated colonialism, rather a protection of key rights, like freedom of expression, the right to a fair trial, life, liberty. You get the idea. These rules would be imposed above a planet's own laws and would be ultimate. So slavery, even if legal on a member planet, would have to be stamped out. Membership to the government would of course be voluntary, and certain exit mechanisms would be included in the Constitution. The benefits offered would not only be the inclusion of tax-funded projects like new hyperlanes, or even the chance to colonize new planets, but also at times monetary relief support, the use of Republic courts, the protection of the Galactic Defense Court, and of course peacekeeping, diplomacy, and dispute resolution services. Secession was the main cause of the Clone Wars, or at least on paper. I prefer how the New Republic lets planets basically freely join and leave the government when compared to the Old Republic, which more heavily protected membership. Sometimes planets want to be independent. That should be allowed. The key is offering benefits, whether the ones I just discussed, or perhaps ease of trade, which seduces systems into joining for the greater good. Changing topic, I believe the Republic's ultimate failure was due largely to what I believe to be a weak constitution and judiciary. Separation of powers refers to the fact that a government's legal powers are split between the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches. The judiciary, or the courts, is the bedrock of democracy, and must be kept extraordinarily strong to uphold the rule of law in such a massive government. My ideal judiciary is appointed by an independent organization, and not the Chancellor. Palpatine was able to take advantage of his long rule to essentially stack the court, and by the time of his duel with Windu, the Jedi Master said that Palpatine had the courts in his hands. As I discussed earlier, the Constitution itself would also need to be ironclad, and should establish courts, including Supreme Courts, with inherent jurisdiction. These things combined would have prevented the illegal formation of the Empire, and even during wartime, laws central to the function and form of government should be immutable. The Jedi, if available, should pledge themselves to the Constitution and the judiciary, rather than the executive or the legislature. Speaking of Jedi, if they are to be arresting people or using government-sanctioned power, the Order needs to somehow be accountable, whether to the people directly or to the institutions of government. The feeling of the Jedi being above the law was fairly prevalent by the time of Order 66. Actions within Republic space or on behalf of the Republic should be authorized directly by some party. It's possible that the new Jedi Council, created during the Yuuzhan Vong War and sort of a hybridization of the Jedi and the government, could be used, but that might be too extreme. A strong judiciary also helps root out corruption, though it can't do so alone. It is impressive that the Republic stood for tens of thousands of years, but by the Clone Wars, the Republic was basically infected from the inside out. Things like term limits and caps to political contributions should be enshrined in the Constitution, and independent organizations like ombudsmen should be established and very prevalent across the government in its entirety. All this is basically a way to uphold the rule of law, which basically means that all are subject to the law, and that the law applies to everyone and every aspect of government. And this extends not only to the Republic government, but also its member states. And for that reason, the Republic would also need a strong police force, and perhaps local federal courts should be established to uphold federal law within systems. On that note, all efforts should be made to avoid core-centric attitudes. The government should try to incorporate anti-xenophobic principles within their constitution, and the government should ensure that it utilizes a voting system which best represents the entire galaxy, not just the rich core worlds. I also like the idea of a movable capital, which spends time throughout the galaxy, like we see in the New Republic in canon. The next thing I want to talk about is a standing military, which led to one of the Republic's downfalls. Even before the Clone Wars, the Republic was using the Jedi Order improperly, has foot soldiers. Planets and sectors should be encouraged to create their own defense fleets. The Republic needs to be able to respond to threats itself, to defend its planets in cases like the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo, which definitely should have been illegal, or to defend the galaxy generally when facing existential threats. The government needs to make sure its member states are upholding federal law. Professor W.S. Tarnopolsky talks of the velvet glove and the iron fist, basically the idea that although the rule of law should be enforced through policy and cooperation, occasionally the force of the law is needed. That includes not only the judiciary, but the armed forces of the government in cases like this where needed. If one of your planets is being genocided by an alien race, you need to be able to step in. That being said, the fleet and the armed forces generally should be purely defensive. We see during the Dark Fleet crisis in Star Wars Legends that even the creation of new military assets can be politically charged. The government should avoid at all costs aggressive military advances or imperialism. That being said, exploration and colonization of uninhabited planets should not only be encouraged but also funded. And that's my perfect government. To summarize, we have a voluntary federation of states with power mostly to systems and planets, with a more limited unitary government. It features a strong constitution favoring the judiciary and the rule of law, supported by independent anti-corruption organizations. It also features a strong military, which allows the Jedi, if they're present, to be not warriors but peacekeepers. The government would offer its member planets many things, from trade routes to diplomacy, and really we see that I've built pretty heavily on the basics of the Galactic Republic, with just a few refinements. That, however, is just my opinion. What is your perfect Star Wars government? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments. No question of the day today, I will tackle to next video. Nonetheless, feel free to leave a question below with the hashtag AskEck. Until next time guys, as always, may the Force be with you.